I wanted to ask you about the jury selection process. How do you go about selecting a jury that's supposed to be impartial, that can be the best possible fit for a case like this that is so high profile?
Right. Well, this is, there's the kind of law on the books answer, and then there's the real answer. So the law on the books answer is you get to ask the jury a lot of questions to try to identify any biases that you might think might lead to an unfair trial, for specifically focused on unfairness for the defendant, but the prosecution can also strike jurors. And they're going to be looking for things like, did you watch the Netflix documentary? And that's why a lot of the jurors had to be struck, because they had too much background information. And the concern there is they're going to bring, obviously, those news stories and facts with them, and they're going to use that as evidence. And we want to make sure that jurors are making decisions only based on the admissible evidence and not things that may have come up, say, in a podcast or in the Netflix documentary. So there were quite a few alternate jurors. I think it's going to be really important to have a lot of alternate jurors, because as the trial goes on, it's a very lengthy trial. You might have jurors that need to be disqualified. And so having that kind of deep bench of jurors is important. I think it has a lot of the ingredients that make it a high profile case. You have vulnerable kids who've been murdered, very concerning sort of motives as to why. Doomsday cults, conspiracy theories. Anytime a mother is murdering her children, I think there's obviously big question marks there about what went wrong. Is there mental illness? So there's a lot of things that make this a high profile case. The media was obviously covering it at the time, with her leaving and having very shady sort of stories about not knowing the whereabouts of her children, which I think for most parents, that immediately set off red flags. If you're being vague or you're unsure of where your children are at any given point in time, that's bizarre. The fact that she is blonde and you can look at these pictures of her as an attractive woman, unfortunately, that creates a lot of media interest. Adultery, multiple strings of suspicious murderers. So there's a lot going on in this trial that makes it, I think, high profile and makes a lot of people interested in the why. Like what would get someone to a point where they would participate in murdering or potentially participate in murdering their children?
What makes this trial complex?
Well, it makes it complex. They're co-defendants, right? So this is just the trial of Lori Daybell, but there will eventually be a trial of her husband. And so making sure that he can also have a fair trial. The not having the cameras in court, part of that might be to try to preserve the potential jury in his trial, to make sure that there isn't so much media frenzy around the Lori side of the trial that when it comes time for him to have his case prosecuted, he can't get a fair shake. So that makes it complicated. There are a lot of it's not complicated in terms of the evidence. If you think about it's so far what's been presented, it's not a complicated story for the jury to understand in terms of what happened and sort of the actions. I think they're really going to be focusing on the why and sort of the mental health of the defendant. And so they haven't gotten to that yet, but obviously there's going to be a lot of testimony around the why part. And obviously you don't need to prove motive. The prosecution doesn't need to prove why. But I think there's going to be a lot of interest in that piece from the perspective of the prosecution and also from the defense. They're going to be, I'm sure, trying to put a lot of the blame back onto her husband, her new, fairly recent husband at the time of the crimes. I think they're going to probably be trying to deflect and say that she was either experiencing trauma or something like that. But we'll see. We'll see how it develops.
A pretty heavy day in the courtroom, and I think that it was very interesting noticing that Lori herself tried to get out of the afternoon session. The judge said no. And then what we are seeing play out in court right now is some very, very graphic evidence, if you will. I know you teach that at the school. What are you surprised about hearing about some of the evidence that's being shared today?
Yeah, so the question with any piece of evidence is, what is it being used to prove? And so when you're showing lots of pictures of shallow graves and bones and body parts, if I were the defense, I would probably be objecting to that, saying this is cumulative, this is excessive. Like, unless there is some question about where the bodies were found, then you might need to see the location to prove where the bodies were found on the Daybell property. But repeated gruesome images can really trigger a sense of rage or anger in the jury to where then they are feeling more vindictive and wanting to blame someone because and there's even research to show that if you see a lot of gruesome imagery of especially harm to children, and then you ask people to say whether or not someone is guilty, they're really looking for a place to validate that feeling of anger and emotion and outrage. And so you want to make sure that the evidence is really introduced for a particular purpose. And once it's been used for that purpose, then maybe the fifth or sixth gruesome image, you have to ask yourself, is it necessary, or is it just kind of, is it sort of cumulative and maybe making the point a little too strongly?